My darlings, I see you, all of you, 12 signs, and I want to begin tonight by telling you something that almost nobody in my profession is going to say to you this month, and I think it is the single most useful thing I have to offer you in all of August. The loudest thing that happens this month is not the most important thing that happens this month. On the 12th of August, a total solar eclipse crosses 20 degrees of Leo, 4 bodies gathered in one sign, the sky going dark at midday. It is dramatic, it is rare, and every single astrologer on this platform, myself included in my other reading this month, is going to build a great deal of noise around it. You will not be able to avoid hearing about the 12th. It will be everywhere. And I want to tell you, plainly, before we go any further, that the 12th is not the message I am asking you to pay attention to tonight. There is a second event in August. It arrives right at the very end of the month, on the 27th into the 28th, and it is quieter, considerably quieter, and it does not come with 4 planets and a darkened sky. It comes, for 5 particular signs, in a form so ordinary that a person could live through it and never once recognize that anything had actually happened. That is exactly why I am building an hour around it. The 5 signs are Capricorn, Cancer, Gemini, Virgo, and Leo, and I have a very specific reason for taking them in that order tonight, which I will explain once we arrive at the last of them. And I am going to tell you, at the very end, precisely why this second message is so easy to miss, and it is not because it is unimportant. It is because of something the 12th does to you, several weeks before the message you actually need arrives, and I do not think anybody has explained that mechanism to you properly before. I will say now what to listen for, so you can play along. At the end of every section tonight, I tell you the specific shape the message is likely to take for that sign. Not a feeling, a form, a phone ringing, a sentence someone says in passing, a piece of paper. Listen for those, because by the time I reach the end of the 5th sign, I think you will already understand the pattern I am about to name outright. I am Madame Aurora, 35 years studying the stars from my office in Manhattan, and let me give you the shape of the whole month first, because there are a great many dates, and I would rather you had them written down than tried to hold them in your head. On the 6th, Venus enters Libra, her own sign, at full strength, and she stays there until the 10th of September. That is the gentlest, most favorable undercurrent running beneath the whole of August, whatever else happens on top of it. On the 11th, Mars enters Cancer, uncomfortable there, and its character shifts for the rest of the month from pursuing toward protecting. On the 12th, the total solar eclipse I have already told you about, 20 degrees and 8 minutes of Leo, on the south node, which is the point of release rather than beginning. I want you to hold that detail, because it is going to matter again before I finish tonight. On the 15th, Mercury conjoins Jupiter in Leo, and for a great many of you that carries a message of its own, enlarged, possibly beyond its actual size. On the 17th, Venus sextiles Jupiter, which is lovely, and on the very same day Mars squares Neptune, which is not, and which I would not trust for any decision involving money, contracts, or your own judgment about what something is actually worth. On the 22nd, the Sun conjoins the South Node at the final degree of Leo, and Virgo season opens. On the 25th, Mercury does the same. And then the stretch I actually want you here for. On the 27th, Mercury reaches cazimi at 4 degrees of Virgo, in the heart of the Sun, the single clearest thinking day of the entire month. And on that same night, into the 28th depending on where in the world you are, a partial lunar eclipse perfects at 4 degrees and 53 minutes of Pisces. And on the 31st, the final day of the month, Jupiter at 13 degrees of Leo trines Saturn, retrograde, at 13 degrees of Aries. The 6th, the 12th, the 17th, the 22nd, the 27th, the 28th, the 31st. Write them down, my darlings, but hold the last 3 especially close, because that is where tonight's reading actually lives. Now, before I go to the signs, let me tell you why a lunar eclipse in Pisces is genuinely different in character from the solar eclipse everybody has already been talking to you about, because the difference is the whole of why this second message is so easy to lose. A solar eclipse is a new moon. It plants something. It is loud because it is a beginning, and beginnings, even difficult ones, tend to announce themselves. A lunar eclipse is a full moon. It does not plant. It reveals. Something that has been developing quietly, out of sight, for weeks or months, reaches the point where it can no longer be hidden, and it surfaces, all at once, into visibility. And this one surfaces in Pisces, which is, of every sign in the zodiac, the one least likely to announce itself with any fanfare at all. Pisces does not deliver news through an event. It delivers it through a feeling that will not quite leave you alone, a dream you cannot immediately shake off in the morning, a sentence somebody says almost as an aside that you find yourself still turning over 3 days later. And it is a partial eclipse, my darlings, not a total one, which I think is rather fitting. You are not going to be handed the whole picture at once. You are going to be handed a piece of it, and the rest is going to depend on whether you are paying enough attention to go looking for what completes it. I want to add one more piece of context before I go to the signs, because it changes how you should hold everything I am about to tell you. This eclipse is also the second of 2 this month, and the second of a pair is, in my experience, consistently the less anticipated of the two, regardless of which sign or house it happens to touch. The first eclipse in any pair gets the anticipation, the build-up, the astrologers marking their calendars for it months in advance. The second one arrives into a sky that people have already stopped watching quite as closely, simply because the season's headline event already happened. That is true every single eclipse season, my darlings, not only this one, and I think it is worth knowing as a permanent pattern rather than a one-off feature of this particular August. Now let us begin. Let us go to Capricorn. My darling Capricorn, your message arrives in the most literal house available to it. The lunar eclipse on the 27th into the 28th falls in your third house. Your third house is the house of the message itself, the sibling, the neighbor, the short conversation, the immediate, and the nearby. There is no house in your chart better suited to a piece of information simply arriving, unglamorously, through an ordinary channel. 2 days earlier, Mercury's cazimi on the 27th falls in your 9th house, the house of meaning, of the larger view, of belief and understanding. So the sequence for you, my darling, runs in a specific and rather elegant order. First the clarity, on the 27th, in the house of the bigger picture. Then, that same night or the next, the actual piece of information, in the house of the ordinary and the near. I want you to notice what that ordering suggests, because it is the opposite of how your sign usually processes things. Your sign collects facts first and arrives at meaning slowly, sometimes years later, after enough evidence has accumulated to justify a conclusion. This month, for these 2 days, the meaning is available to you before the fact fully lands, which means you may well feel that something significant is approaching before you can say exactly what it is. Do not discount that feeling for lack of a specific cause yet. The cause is 2 days behind the feeling, not absent. For some of you, the message is genuinely a phone call or a text from somebody in your immediate circle that seems minor on its surface and that you will find yourself still thinking about a week later. For some, it is a piece of paper, a letter, a document, an email you nearly archive without reading properly. For some, it is something a sibling says, plainly, in passing, that turns out to have been carrying more than its own weight. Your sign's particular risk this month, my darling, is efficiency. You process incoming information quickly, sort it, file it, and move to the next task, and that is a genuine strength in nearly every other context. This is the 1 week in August where I would ask you to slow that process down. Read the message twice. Let the phone call sit in your memory for a day before deciding what it meant. Do not let this one slip past you because it arrived in an envelope rather than an event. Let me say one more thing to you specifically, my darling, because your sign has a particular blind spot around exactly this kind of week. You are, of the 12 signs, the one most likely to be genuinely busy at the end of August, closing out a quarter, finishing what you set out to finish before autumn properly begins, and the message I am describing is going to arrive in the middle of that entirely legitimate busyness, rather than in a quiet moment set aside for it. It will not wait for a better time. Third house transits rarely do. If a message from somebody close to you lands on the 27th in the middle of an already full day, resist the urge to answer briefly and return to the task in front of you. The task will still be there in 20 minutes. The window for hearing this particular thing properly is considerably narrower than that. Now let me speak to Cancer. My darling Cancer, your message runs in the reverse order from Capricorns, and I think that reversal is rather beautiful, because the two of you are going to be having, in a sense, the same experience from opposite ends of it. The lunar eclipse on the 27th into the 28th falls in your ninth house, meaning belief. The larger view, distance, the philosophy underneath the particular events of a life. This is not a small household matter for you this month, my darling. It is closer to a shift in how you understand an entire area of your life, arriving all at once, at the end of a month that will have felt, until this point, fairly ordinary. And 2 days before it, on the 27th, Mercury's cazimi falls in your third house. The message itself, plain and immediate, arriving first. So for you, unlike for Capricorn, the fact comes before the meaning. Something specific will be said, or written, or mentioned, on or around the 27th, and it will seem, at the time, like an ordinary piece of information. And then, within a day or two, as the lunar eclipse perfects, you are going to find that ordinary piece of information rearranging something considerably larger than itself. Not the fact changing, your understanding of what the fact means, changing around it. For some of you, this arrives through education, publishing, a long-distance connection, or something involving another country or another belief system entirely. For some, it is a single sentence from somebody older or more experienced than you, delivered without any apparent weight behind it, that turns out to be the key to a much larger pattern you have been living inside without fully seeing. For some, it is simply the moment a worldview you have been quietly revising for years finally completes itself. Your sign's risk here, my darling, is emotional overwhelm arriving at the wrong end of the process. You will feel the size of this before you can articulate it, and your instinct under that kind of pressure is to retreat inward and process alone, which I understand and would not ask you to abandon entirely. But do not let the size of the feeling convince you the actual information was too small to have caused it. It was not too small. Ninth house shifts rarely announce their own scale in advance. Do not let this one slip past you, because it arrived wearing the shape of an ordinary conversation. I want to add one thing for you specifically, because your sign has a particular habit that will work against you this week if I do not name it. When something feels larger than you can immediately explain, your instinct is to protect it, to hold it privately until you have made sense of it alone, sometimes for a very long time. I would ask you, just this once, to do the opposite. Say the fact out loud to somebody you trust, even before you understand what it means, in the days right after the 27th. Speaking it plainly, before you have finished processing it, will very often help the meaning arrive faster than sitting with it in silence ever could. Now, before I go to Gemini, let me pause for a moment. If what I have said so far is landing, tap that little like button below this video. It is a small gesture, and it does something real, which is tell YouTube to carry this to somebody who is about to spend the last week of August with her attention entirely elsewhere. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment, because 3 signs remain, and the pattern underneath all 5 is going to become impossible to miss by the time I reach the last one. Now let me speak to Gemini. My darling Gemini, your message arrives in the house of your public standing, and I want to prepare you, because of the 5 signs tonight. Yours is the one most likely to be mistaken for something purely professional when it is not only that. The lunar eclipse on the 27th into the 28th falls in your 10th house. Career, reputation, the visible position you occupy in the world, the thing people say about you when you are not in the room. A full moon, there is a culmination, my darling, not a beginning. Something about how you are seen, professionally or publicly, reaches a point where it can no longer stay ambiguous, and becomes, instead, clear. And I want you to notice something else happening at the same time, because it changes what this actually means for you. On the 22nd and the 25th, the Sun and then Mercury conjoin the South Node at the very last degree of Leo in your 3rd house, your own natural house, the house of the message, of communication, of the immediate exchange between you and the people around you. That is a releasing configuration, my darling, not an acquiring one. Something involving a message, a piece of communication, a conversation you have been having or avoiding, is closing during exactly the same stretch that your public standing reaches its culmination. I do not think that is a coincidence. I think the 3rd house matter, whatever it has been, is part of what produces the 10th house clarity. For some of you, this is a piece of professional news that lands right at the very end of the month, after weeks of uncertainty about how a particular situation was going to resolve. For some, it is the moment other people's private conversations about you become, suddenly, public information, in a way that is more clarifying than damaging, whatever your instinct says in the first few hours. For some, it is simply the end of a long internal argument about how to present something, a decision that has been sitting unmade for weeks, resolving itself almost on its own once the surrounding noise finally clears. Your sign's risk this month, and I want to say this plainly, is that your considerable talent for talking about a thing will substitute for actually sitting with it. A 10th house culmination deserves more than a clever paragraph explaining it to your friends before you have fully understood it yourself. Give yourself the 2 or 3 days between the cazimi and the eclipse to simply notice what is happening before you narrate it to anybody. Do not let this one slip past you because you talked your way past it before you had finished feeling it. And I want to add one small, practical note for you specifically. Whatever the professional news turns out to be, good or difficult, give yourself 24 hours before you post about it, discuss it widely, or turn it into the version of the story you will tell going forward. Your sign converts experience into narrative faster than any other, which is a genuine gift most of the time, and this particular week it will work against you if you let it. Let the raw version exist, privately, for one full day, before it becomes the polished one everybody else hears. Now let me speak to Virgo, and I want to tell you first that the 27th is, in the plainest possible terms, your day, before I tell you what happens the day after it. Mercury, your own ruling planet, reaches cazimi at 4 degrees of your own sign on the 27th. In the heart of the sun, in your first house. That is the single clearest thinking day of your entire year, my darling, not merely of August. And I want you to actually use it rather than simply enjoying the sensation of unusual clarity and letting the day pass without applying it to anything. And then, that same night or the next, the lunar eclipse perfects in your 7th house. Partnership. The other person, the relationship, in whatever form it currently takes, that matters most to your daily life. I want you to sit with the sequencing here, because it is the gentlest and most useful arrangement of any of tonight's 5 signs. You are handed the clearest possible instrument, in your own sign, the day before you are handed something significant about a partnership. That is not an accident of timing your sign should waste. It means that whatever surfaces in that relationship at the end of the month, you are better equipped to actually hear it accurately than you will be at almost any other point this year. For some of you, this is a partner finally saying, plainly, something that has been sitting unspoken for weeks or months. For some, it is your own realization, arriving with unusual clarity about what a particular relationship actually needs from you that it has not been getting. For some, it is a business partnership rather than a romantic one, a colleague or collaborator whose position on something finally becomes clear after a period of genuine ambiguity. Your sign's risk this month is a specific and rather ironic one. Because the 27th feels so clear, so unusually lucid, your instinct will be to conclude something definitively on that day itself, and I would ask you to resist that. The clarity is for receiving what the eclipse brings the following day, not for reaching a verdict before it has arrived. Let the sharp thinking of the 27th be in service of the 7th house matter that follows it, rather than a separate event you close the book on too early. Let me tell you about Genevieve, because I think her story will make this considerably more useful to you than the astrology alone can manage. Genevieve was a Virgo client of mine, born in early September, who came to me the year before last, in the September just after an August very much like this one. She had been married for 11 years, comfortably, in the ordinary way a long marriage settles into its own rhythms, and the middle 2 weeks of that particular August had been consumed, entirely, by something else. Her mother had fallen seriously ill, suddenly, and Genevieve had spent nearly 3 weeks almost entirely absent from her own home, managing hospitals and specialists, and the particular exhaustion of being the one who holds a family together during a crisis. Her mother recovered. Slowly, but she recovered, and by the last week of that August, Genevieve told me, she had returned home in a state she described as simply relieved to be normal again, tired in a way that made everything else feel smaller and less urgent by comparison. And on an ordinary evening near the end of that month, her husband said something to her. quietly, while she was only half listening, still consumed by the aftermath of the previous 3 weeks. He said that he had been lonely. Not dramatically, not as an accusation, simply that, in his own words, and it passed, at the time, almost without registering, because Genevieve was so entirely occupied with the crisis that had just ended. She told me she genuinely did not remember the conversation properly until nearly a year later, when he told her, in a considerably harder conversation, that he had been trying to tell her something for a long time and had felt, that evening, that he had finally said it plainly, and that she had not heard him. My darling Virgos, I want to be careful with this story, because it is not a story about a marriage that ended, and it is not a story about Genevieve failing anybody. What actually happened to her happens to a great many people during exactly this kind of month. A large, loud crisis consumes the whole of a person's attention, resolves itself, and in the relief that follows, a quieter and considerably more important signal arrives in the very same window and simply does not register, because there is nothing left to register it with. She and her husband are, I want you to know, still together, and are, by her account, in a genuinely better place than they were that year, precisely because she went back, eventually, and asked him to say the whole of it again, properly, once she actually had the capacity to hear it. But she told me something I have kept ever since, about that particular evening. She said, I have wondered so many times whether I would have heard him if my mother had not been ill that same month. I do not actually know. I only know that I didn't, and that not hearing him very nearly cost us more than the illness ever did. Now let me speak to Leo, and I have saved you for last on purpose, because your month has been the loudest of anybody's, and that is precisely why your final message is the one most at risk of being lost entirely. The eclipse on the 12th happened directly to you. 20 degrees of your own sign, 4 bodies gathered there, on the south node. And on the 22nd and the 25th, the Sun and then Mercury conjoined that same south node, at the very last degree of Leo, in your own first house, closing out what has genuinely been the most personally significant fortnight of your entire year. By the 27th, my darling, a considerable amount has already happened to you, and I want to be honest that I think a portion of you is going to reach the last week of August simply tired, in the specific way a person is tired after being the center of an unusually intense stretch, whether or not anything about it was actually difficult. And that is exactly the moment the eclipse on the 27th into the 28th arrives, in your 8th house. Intimacy, shared resources, the private, unshared depth between you and one other person. Not a public matter, not a continuation of the very public month you have just had. Something quiet and considerably more personal, arriving right as your capacity for noticing anything further is at its lowest point all year. 2 days earlier, on the 27th, Mercury's cazimi falls in your 2nd house, which is where your ruling planet completes its own transit through your money and your sense of your own worth. Something practical, related to value or resources, becomes unusually clear that day. And then, the following night, the 8th house eclipse asks something considerably more intimate of you, in an area that is not about the public self at all. For some of you, this is a private conversation with a partner, entirely unrelated to anything that has happened publicly this month, about the actual depth of what is shared between you. For some, it is something financial, held jointly with another person, a debt, an arrangement, a piece of shared history finally becoming clear. For some, it is simply the first quiet moment, after a genuinely loud month, in which you are alone with somebody who actually knows you, and something real gets said in that quiet that would never have survived being said anywhere louder. Your sign's risk here is the most specific of tonight's 5, and I want to name it plainly. You have had, this month, an extraordinary amount of attention pointed at you, from the sky and, quite possibly, from the people around you as well. The 8th house does not want an audience. It wants one person and a closed door and your full attention rather than the performed version of it you have been running on since the 12th. Do not walk into the last week of August still oriented toward being seen. This one is not for being seen. It is for actually listening. Do not let this one slip past you because you assumed the loudest part of your month had already happened. One further word for you specifically, my darling, because I think you need it more than any of tonight's other 4 signs. You have spent a genuinely intense fortnight being watched, discussed, and centered, whether or not any of it was comfortable, and there is a real temptation, once that finally quiets, to want to keep being seen a little longer, to extend the attention rather than let it recede. Resist that, just for these last few days. The 8th house does not compete with an audience for your focus. It simply waits until the audience has gone and asks whether anything is left of you for the one person still in the room. Now, my darlings, let me speak to the 7 signs I have not named tonight, because every chart receives this eclipse somewhere, and I do not believe in a reading that gives 5 of you the whole of my attention and leaves the rest of you standing outside. Aries, the eclipse falls in your 12th house, so your message arrives from somewhere private, possibly from within, a piece of self-knowledge surfacing from behind the scenes rather than from another person. It will feel less like news and more like a realization you did not go looking for. Taurus, the eclipse falls in your 11th house of friendship and community, so watch a group conversation or a message from someone slightly outside your closest circle. Something said there carries more than its apparent weight. Libra, the eclipse falls in your 6th house of daily work and routine, so the message is likely to arrive through the ordinary texture of an average day rather than through anything that announces itself, possibly through your body or your health, which deserves a plainer reading than your instinct for balance usually gives it. Scorpio, the eclipse falls in your 5th house of romance and creativity, so something related to a child, a creative project, or a romantic matter reaches a point of unexpected clarity, and your sign should resist the urge to investigate it forensically before simply receiving it. Sagittarius, the eclipse falls in your 4th house of home and family, so the message likely arrives from within your own household, possibly from a parent, and it is worth more attention than your instinct to keep moving outward will want to give it. Aquarius, the eclipse falls in your 2nd house of money and self-worth, so pay attention to anything involving a number, a rate, or a piece of financial information that arrives quietly during this window, and to what your own reaction to it tells you about a belief you have been carrying about your own value. And Pisces, the eclipse falls in your own 1st house, your own sign, which makes this your event more directly than anyone else's tonight, apart from tonight's 5. Something about your own sense of who you are reaches culmination at the end of this month, and I would ask you, more than any other sign, to actually notice it rather than let it pass as simply a mood. Every one of you receives this somewhere, my darlings, whether or not your sign was one of the 5 I gave the whole evening to. Now, before I go further, do something with me. It takes 20 seconds and it works whatever your sign. Think back to the middle of this month. Whatever was loudest for you, whatever consumed the most of your attention around the 12th, whether it was the eclipse itself or something entirely unrelated to astrology that simply happened to occupy the same stretch of time, now ask yourself, honestly, how much attention you have left. Not how much you have in general. How much is actually available, right now, tonight, for something quiet arriving in the last few days of this month. If the honest answer is not very much, my darling, that is not a failing. It is simply useful information, and I am about to tell you exactly what to do with it. Now let me address something before I give you the last part, because a reading built around a message you might miss should be honest about what happens if you do. Some of you are going to reach the 1st of September and realize, only in retrospect, that something did happen in that window, and that you were not paying attention when it did. I do not want you to spend the autumn punishing yourself over that, because it happens to nearly everyone at some point, and your sign is not uniquely careless for having been tired at the wrong moment. Here is what I would actually tell you if that is where you find yourself. Go back. Not obsessively, and not to manufacture significance where there genuinely was none, but if, looking back at the 27th or the 28th, something surfaces in your memory that you had filed under ordinary and are now less certain belongs there, it is not too late to return to it. Ask the person what they meant. Reread the message. Sit with the dream you half remember rather than deciding it was nothing simply because a month has passed since you had it. And I want to say one more thing, gently, because a video promising a message risks landing badly on anyone in a season of real difficulty. If what has consumed your attention this month is not simply loud but genuinely heavy, grief, illness, a crisis in your own life or someone else's, I am not going to tell you that missing a quiet signal from the sky is the thing you should be worrying about right now. Attend to what is actually in front of you. The sky is patient, my darlings, in a way that very few things in an actual crisis are, and there will be other windows. And if what has been loud this month is not an external event at all, but a difficult internal one, and you recognize, honestly, that you have very little capacity left for anything else right now, I would ask only one small thing of you, and it is considerably gentler than the 4 I am about to give everyone else. Simply do not assume, if these last few days pass quietly and nothing obvious happens, that this means nothing was actually offered. Some messages arrive and are received later, all at once, weeks or months on, once there is finally room for them. That is not a failure of timing on your part. It is simply how a great deal of real growth actually works, arriving in full only once a person has the capacity to hold it. Now, my darlings, let me give you something practical, because I would rather leave you with a method than only with a warning. There are 4 things, and they are small, and any one of them takes only a few minutes. The first. Clear one evening between the 26th and the 28th. Not a large gesture. Simply decline one thing you would ordinarily say yes to and leave the space genuinely open rather than filling it with something else the moment it appears. A message that arrives into a full schedule gets heard at the volume of whatever else is competing with it. Give it a quiet room to land in instead. The second, and this one is specific to the character of a Pisces full moon. Keep something by your bed on the night of the 27th, and write down whatever you remember the moment you wake, before you check anything else, before the day's first task takes hold of your mind. Pisces speaks fluently through dreams and through the strange, half-formed thoughts of the first few minutes of a morning, and both are gone within about 90 seconds of full waking unless you catch them first. The third, when something small strikes you as slightly more significant than it should, in that window, do not immediately explain it away. Your instinct, for every sign tonight, will be to find the ordinary reason a particular sentence, or a particular feeling, does not need further thought. Let it sit for a day instead of resolving it that same hour. Genevieve's evening would have looked entirely different if she had simply asked her husband, the next morning, what he had meant, rather than letting the exhaustion of the previous 3 weeks close the subject before it had properly opened. And the fourth. If you keep any kind of record of your days, however loosely, write one line about the 27th and the 28th specifically, even if nothing appears to have happened. Not because you are hunting for meaning where there is none, because a partial eclipse, by its nature, only shows you part of the picture at the time, and the rest of it very often becomes visible only in hindsight, when you go looking for it later with the benefit of everything that happened afterward. A line written at the time gives that later hindsight something accurate to work with, rather than a memory that has already been smoothed over by a month of other things happening on top of it. Now, before I give you the last part, if this reading has found you tonight, tap that like button. It genuinely does something, which is carry this to somebody who is about to spend the last week of August with her guard entirely down. And if you have not yet subscribed, do it now, because I will be back before the 27th with more on this particular window, and I would rather you did not miss it. And leave me a comment, and I want the specific thing rather than the general thing. Tell me your sign, and tell me one thing that has already taken up most of your attention this month, whatever it was, astrological or otherwise. Not the message you are waiting for, the thing that has been loud. I read every single comment, truly, and I want to tell you why I am asking for that rather than for a prediction of what is coming. Because naming what has already been loud is the first and most useful step in actually noticing when something quieter arrives, and a comment section full of 40 answers to that one question is, in itself, 40 people doing the exact exercise this whole reading has been building toward. Now, my darlings, let me give you the thing I have been building toward the whole of this hour. I said the same kind of thing at the end of every section tonight, in 5 different forms. Capricorn, do not let it slip past you because it arrived in an envelope rather than an event. Cancer, because it wore the shape of an ordinary conversation. Gemini, because you talked your way past it before you had finished feeling it. Virgo, because the clarity felt like a verdict rather than a preparation. Leo, because you assumed the loudest part of your month had already happened. 5 different reasons, my darlings, and I want you to notice that every single one of them describes the same underlying failure, arriving through a different door. Here is the mechanism, and I think it is more useful to you than anything else I have said tonight, because it does not only apply to this particular August. It applies every single year, to nearly everyone, and almost nobody has ever named it plainly. Your attention, across a month, is not unlimited. It behaves, in practice, rather like a single slot that gets filled by whatever announces itself most insistently, and once that slot is filled, a great many people, quietly and without deciding to, simply stop scanning for anything else that might deserve it. On the 12th of August, something enormous happened, or was at least discussed as though it had. 4 planets, a darkened sky, every astrologer you follow building an hour around it. Whether or not it produced anything dramatic in your own actual life, it filled the slot. It became, in your own mind, the significant thing that August was going to be about, and I think a great many of you, entirely without noticing, quietly closed the account after that. The month had delivered its news. Whatever else happened for the remaining weeks was simply the ordinary texture of an ordinary life continuing. And that is precisely the condition the second message needed in order to arrive unnoticed, my darling. And I do not think it is a coincidence that the sky arranges itself this way as often as it does. A new moon, a solar eclipse, is loud by its very nature, because it is a beginning, and a beginning has to be loud enough to actually start something. A full moon, a lunar eclipse, is quiet by its very nature, because it is not beginning anything. It is only revealing what has already been growing, out of sight, for weeks, and a thing that has already been growing does not need to announce itself. It only needs you to still be looking when it finally becomes visible. So the two of them were always going to be different volumes, my darlings. Eclipse or no eclipse. Loud month or quiet one. But the fact that your own attention had already been spent, deliberately, and rather effectively, on the louder one, made the quieter one even easier to lose than it would otherwise have been. You were not careless. You were simply human, and your mind did exactly what minds do, which is treat the first loud thing as the whole of the story and relax its guard once that story appeared to be finished. I want you to hold on to that, my darling, well past the end of this particular August, because it is going to happen again. Not necessarily through a solar eclipse, through a big, loud, well-discussed event of any kind in any area of your life, followed, quietly, by a second and considerably more personal one that arrives while your guard is still down from the first. A large professional milestone, followed by a quiet remark from somebody who actually needed you. A dramatic family event, followed, weeks later, by a much smaller conversation that turns out to matter more than the drama did. The pattern is not really about the sky, my darlings. The sky simply happens to be showing it to you with unusual clarity this particular month. And I want to name plainly the cost of missing it, because I think a vague warning is easy to nod along to, and a specific one is easier to actually act on. The cost is very rarely that the quiet thing disappears entirely and never returns. Genevieve's husband did, eventually, say the whole of it again, in a harder conversation, a year later. The cost is nearly always that the quiet thing has to wait, sometimes for a considerable while, for the next moment brave enough to try again, and in the meantime it sits, unaddressed, quietly shaping a great deal more than either of you realizes while it waits. That is the actual stake in these last few days, my darling. Not a single missed opportunity, gone forever. A delay that costs more than anybody watching the loud, dramatic solar eclipse on the 12th would ever have guessed a quiet Tuesday at the end of the month could cost. Do you remember what I told you about the partial eclipse? That you are only given part of the picture, and the rest depends on whether you go looking for it. That is not only true of the 27th, my darling. It is true of every loud month you will ever live through. The full picture is very rarely delivered all at once, in the moment everybody is watching. It arrives in 2 parts, and the second part nearly always comes quieter than the first, precisely when you have the least energy left to notice it. Genevieve's husband said the whole of what he needed to say, that evening, in an ordinary tone, in the middle of an exhausted week. It was not a small thing dressed as a small thing to spare her feelings. It was the whole thing, spoken plainly, and it simply arrived into a mind that had already spent its attention on something louder and, in its own way, entirely legitimate. I am not telling you tonight that a crisis in your life is less important than a quiet remark that follows it. I would never tell you that. What I am telling you is that the quiet remark deserves a portion of your attention too, even when, especially when, there is nothing left of it feeling readily available, because the people and the moments that matter most to us very rarely compete loudly for a hearing. They simply wait, at a normal volume, for us to still be listening once the noise has finished. You have 1 week left in this particular August, my darlings. The loud thing has already happened, or it is happening now, or perhaps, for some of you, this month has been entirely ordinary, and the loudest thing you experienced was simply the anticipation everybody built around the 12th. Whatever filled your slot this month, I would ask you, for these last few days, to leave one small corner of your attention open anyway. Something is arriving quietly. It is not going to compete for the space. It is only going to use whatever you happen to have left. And I will give you one further date before I close, because it gives the whole of this a natural resting point. On the 31st, the actual final day of August, Jupiter, at 13 degrees of Leo trines Saturn, retrograde, at 13 degrees of Aries. Expansion in agreement with structure, on the last day of the month. It is the quietest aspect of the whole of August, and I think that is rather fitting, given everything I have told you tonight. Whatever arrived on the 27th or the 28th, the 31st is not a day for anything dramatic. It is a day for looking back at those 2 dates with 3 days of distance and asking, plainly, what actually happened and whether you were there for it. Not a verdict, simply an honest accounting, 3 days on, which is very often exactly the amount of distance a quiet thing needs before its shape becomes visible. My darlings, before I let you go, 3 small things. 1. If any part of this reading found you tonight, if you recognize the shape your own message is likely to take, if Genevieve's story described a month you have lived through in some form of your own, tap that like button. It is the simplest way to tell YouTube to carry this to somebody who is about to spend the last week of August with her attention entirely spoken for. 2. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because I will be back before the 27th with more on this specific window, and again after the 28th once we can all look back properly at what it actually brought. If you become a member of this channel, readings reach you before they are published, and you and I actually speak in the comments, because I read member comments first, and I answer there more often and more personally than I am able to anywhere else. 3. And this is the one I care about most. Tell me what has been loud this month, and then, if you are willing, come back after the 28th and tell me, underneath that same comment, what turned out to be quiet. I read every single comment, truly, and I want to tell you why I am asking for it in 2 parts rather than 1. Because right now, tonight, none of you can know yet what the second half is going to be, and a comment written in genuine uncertainty, revisited honestly a few days later, is worth considerably more than a prediction dressed up as an answer. I want to see, at the end of the month, how many of you were right about what had been loud, and how many of you were surprised by what turned out to be quiet. And if this reading gave you something and you ever want to say thank you more directly, a super thanks is never expected and always felt, and it is a genuine part of how I keep making these readings as carefully as I make them. If you know somebody who has had an unusually loud August, send this to her tonight, because the quiet part of her month has not arrived yet, and she has a handful of days left to leave room for it. You may not realize how much a single share matters. It is how this work finds the person who needs it. Thank you, my darlings. This community has become something I genuinely did not expect when I began. An August final message, my darlings, and I want to tell you plainly, one more time, what I actually mean by that title, because it is not what you thought when this reading began. It does not mean the biggest thing this month is still to come. The 12th already happened, or it is happening as you watch this, and I am not asking you to wait for something to outshine it, because I do not think anything this month is going to. It means the last thing to arrive is often the one that was actually addressed to you personally, rather than to the whole of the sky at once. A total solar eclipse belongs to everybody. 4 planets in Leo were the same for all 12 signs, and for every person on this earth watching the same darkened sky. But a quiet remark from somebody who knows you, a document that arrives at exactly the wrong exhausted moment, a dream you very nearly do not write down, those belong only to you, and they are considerably more likely to actually change something in your life than the loud, shared, universally discussed event that came 2 weeks before them. Capricorn, through the envelope rather than the event. Cancer, through the ordinary conversation that turns out not to be ordinary. Gemini, through the culmination that arrives once you stop narrating it. Virgo, through the clarity that was meant to prepare you rather than conclude anything. And Leo, my darling, through the quiet after the loudest month of your year, with one person, behind a closed door, actually listening. The 12th was for everyone. The 27th, my darlings, is for you. Leave the room open. Whatever it is not going to knock loudly enough to be heard over anything else. It is only going to arrive, quietly, and wait to see whether you were still paying attention. I am Madame Aurora from Manhattan, and I love you, all 12 signs of the zodiac. I will see you before the eclipse.